Whenever people come close to death, they often say the same thing, that their entire lives flashed in their eyes, usually in just seconds. Dr. Sampania at NYU Langone has documented that they see fragments of childhood, faces, small scenes, things people haven't thought about in ages all appearing in one last surge. And that makes you wonder how decades of existence can fit in a time frame that small, and if that means the majority of it wasn't worth remembering. Because when you look closely at how humans actually live, you easily see how the things that become memories are always short. The things that lead to them take years. The moments we actually lived were much fewer than we think. The rest of it, the vast majority, was waiting, anticipating, hoping, worrying, preparing, imagining, almost living but not quite. Maybe the brain only replays the highlights because highlights were all there ever really were. The rest was simply build-up, and suddenly you understand why time feels slow in the moment but fast in memory, why we long for big moments but mostly live in the quiet spaces around them, why anticipation hurts but also fuels us, and why so much of being human is learning how to live in the space before things happen. That's the patience paradox, where 99% of your life is anticipation and only 1% is the thing you are waiting for. And you can see it everywhere once you try. Olympic athletes, people who reach the absolute peak of physical discipline, their entire identity is built on training for moments that last seconds. Usain Bolt trained 4 years for a race that lasted 9.58 seconds. Gymnasts practice thousands of hours for a routine that might be under a minute, and that minute alone gets to overshadow the years they spent preparing. Mount Everest climbers spend around 6 weeks acclimatizing on the mountain. 6 weeks of cold, altitude sickness, exhaustion, for maybe 20 minutes at the summit before they have to come back down. If life were truly about the moment, these timelines would make no sense. But they do, because the real weight of life sits in the preparation, not the peak. Daniel Kahneman proposed the peak end rule after studying how people remember experiences. The brain doesn't store everything, it highlights the peak, the ending, and pretty much discards the rest. You could live through a 10-day trip, but your memory of it will shrink to 2 or 3 moments. The whole experience becomes fragments that your brain decided were enough, and the rest just becomes noise. So no wonder a life can flash by in seconds. Most of it was never coded deeply enough to be ever remembered anyway. Yet we're the ones constantly feeding the cycle. Not consciously, no one wakes up and says, "Let me turn my entire life into a waiting room." But look at any random week of your life. There's always something on the horizon. A package arriving tomorrow, a trip next month, a date you're nervous for, a test result, a job interview, a message you hope someone will send back. Humans stack layers of anticipation without noticing it. Small ones, medium ones, lifelong ones, and each one keeps stealing away space from the present. Psychologists Daniel Gilbert and Tim Wilson studied this exact pattern. Their research on effective forecasting found that humans are terrible at predicting how future events will actually feel. But we still spend enormous amounts of time imagining them. We overestimate how long the highs will last, underestimate how quickly we adapt, and because of that, we inflate the importance of the future. Yet, when you reach them, they'd last for a moment before you're already thinking about the next. Brickman and Campbell call this hedonic adaptation, the tendency for humans to return to a baseline of feeling, no matter how good the moment was. Joy spikes, fades quickly, and resets, and reward prediction error shows exactly what dopamine does. It surges before the goal, then drops sharply right after. The moment of arrival is neurologically less interesting than the journey toward it, because we aren't built to enjoy having. We're built to enjoy moving toward, meaning most of the emotional weight in your life doesn't come from living. It comes from thinking about what you're going to live. The future always seems to take up more space than the present. We keep reaching ahead, and even when we try to live in the moment, the mind drifts back to its favourite habit, imagining what comes next. And the brain rewards that. Dopamine spikes more in the anticipation of reward than when the reward actually arrives. A pattern shown in Nora Volkow's work at the NIH and multiple reinforcement learning studies, which explains why life is emotionally busiest right before something happens. Because most of the feelings in your life come from things that haven't even happened yet, and we're wired that way for reasons much older than psychology. Early humans survived because they could delay gratification. Hunting required patience, gathering required repetition, Tracking required long stretches of nothing. The ancestors who couldn't tolerate waiting simply didn't last long enough to pass down their impatience. Waiting isn't empty, it's emotionally packed. Think about the types of waiting we experience. There's hopeful waiting, the buzz of imagining something good coming your way, even if you know it's sometimes a long shot. There's anxious waiting as well, exam results, medical news, job interviews, a period where your entire being feels suspended in uncertainty, and uncertainty itself is its own category. A 2016 study from University College London found that not knowing an outcome triggers more stress than knowing a bad outcome for sure. The brain hates the undefined. It would rather face pain than possibility, and monotony creates a different kind of waiting, the slow repetition of daily routines, where half the time you're doing one thing while thinking about another. Killingsworth and Gilbert's 2010 study showed that people spend almost half their waking lives thinking about something other than what they're doing, almost always something in the future. This makes the paradox simple. The waiting isn't a rest between actual moments, it is the emotional fabric of our lives. And you can see it everywhere, in the smallest parts of your day. Life keeps showing us the same ratio over and over again. 99% build-up, 1% results. The problem is that today social media makes everyone's highlight reels visible all the time, which makes your own 1% moments feel smaller in comparison and your 99% feel longer and emptier. Instant gratification culture made it so the easier things become, the more impatient we get and the slower waiting feels. Productivity culture makes us obsessed with optimizing the future instead of actually being in the present. Consumer culture trains us to constantly look for the next thing, shrinking satisfaction into tiny bursts. Zimbardo and Boyd's time perspective theory shows that modern people are pushed heavily into a future orientation, always thinking ahead, and Sherry Turkle talks about how technology creates anticipation loops, tiny cycles of checking, waiting, refreshing, expecting, like micro versions of the same life pattern. Everything becomes a countdown to something else. And so our fears keep rising from the future, not the present. Camus said the absurd comes from the gap between our hunger for meaning and the tiny moments we actually get. We chase something lasting, but the things that feel meaningful are always fleeting. Heidegger believed humans are fundamentally beings toward, creatures who live ahead of themselves, always projecting into the future. So, how do you live without feeling like you're constantly not there yet? Like you're always waiting for real life to start? Savouring, a studied psychological skill from Fred Bryant, teaches people to intentionally notice the small sensory details of ordinary moments, to stretch them a little so time doesn't slip by unnoticed. Temporal reframing can shift your sense of waiting. Instead of seeing the future as a distant arrival point, you frame the present as it's unfolding. Goal spacing matters too. When your goals sit too close together, you never get a pause. You just sprint from one anticipation to the next. And Barbara Fredrickson's work on micro-moments shows that tiny doses of connection, beauty or curiosity can act like small peak moments sprinkled throughout daily life instead of waiting for the big ones. Because ultimately, the paradox resolves itself only when you stop treating the 1% as the only part that counts. Because if the 1% moments are why we keep going, the 99% is where we become who we are.